Jordan Peterson and Nick Fuentes said something that shook the world. They claimed that when humanity loses its moral roots, when people drift away from their creator, Islam will be the only system still standing firm. They said Islam carries a perfect balance, discipline, family, order, and above all, faith, iman. And any society that keeps these values alive can never truly collapse. Peterson said the West has forgotten God, and that's why it has become hollow from the inside. Fuentes said Islam has managed to protect its identity and faith, and that's why people will eventually be drawn toward it. That was the bold prediction. That in the coming times, Islam won't just remain a religion, but will rise as a global moral force. And when people heard that, they were shocked. But in truth, they weren't merely praising Islam. They were holding up a mirror to humanity. They were saying, if you're searching for peace and purpose, look toward the system where faith is still alive. Look toward Islam till you ever notice how some people, man, they start off just trying to understand the world. And then they end up staring right into the soul of something way bigger than themselves. That's kind of what happened with Jordan Peterson. Like, here's this psychology professor, this intellectual guy who started out talking about meaning, myth, and personal responsibility. And then one day, boom, he's knee deep in conversations about Islam, and not in that cheap surface level media way. I mean, the dude was curious. You could tell. The way he talked about it wasn't like someone trying to criticize or defend. It was like someone trying to decode something ancient, something powerful. He had this tone where you could almost hear him thinking out loud, like, wait a minute, what's going on here? Why does this religion still hold people together when everything else in the West is falling apart? Ta-da, it's wild, man. Because when Peterson talked about Islam, it wasn't from a place of hate or even fascination. It was like respect mixed with confusion. He'd go, there's something here, something about order, something about discipline. And honestly, that hits deep. Because look at the world we're in. Total chaos, no direction, no moral compass. Everyone's got an opinion, but no one's got a center. And here's Peterson, this Canadian academic, saying maybe the reason people are drawn to Islam is because it still offers structure. It's like the last fortress of meaning in a world that's completely gone off the rails. Deja, and I think that's what freaked people out about him. Because when a Western intellectual, someone who's made a career defending reason and individuality, suddenly starts saying, hey, maybe this ancient faith has something figured out. The system doesn't know what to do with that. He wasn't converting. He wasn't preaching. He was observing. And that's what made it even more interesting. He'd talk about how Islam still connects every individual action to something divine. Like nothing's random, everything matters. He compared it to how modern people live scrolling, consuming lost. And you could hear it in his voice, like he was realizing maybe that's why they're not as lost as us. You know what's crazy, man? When Peterson talked about Islam, you could feel he wasn't just talking about religion. He was talking about the human condition. Like, he was trying to figure out what keeps people grounded when the entire modern world feels like it's floating in space. He said once that Western culture has reached a point where everything is permissible, but nothing matters. Think about that. You can do anything, say anything, be anything, and somehow it all still feels empty. That's heavy. And that's exactly what led him toward Islam in those deeper conversations. Ta-da, he looked at how Muslims live, how 5 times a day they stop everything and pray. He saw it as a rhythm, a reminder. It's not just ritual, it's architecture for the soul. It's discipline, like brushing your teeth, but for your spirit. And he loved that because his whole message was about responsibility and order. He'd say, you want meaning, then carry something heavy. And he saw Islam as a society that actually does that collectively. Like, imagine 1 billion people aligning their lives around that kind of discipline. That's not a joke. That's a civilization built around submission. Not in a weak way, but in the sense of surrendering to something bigger than your ego. Jordan Peterson saw that and went, damn, maybe that's what we're missing. Because in the West, we killed God, right? We replaced him with comfort, with entertainment, with politics. But none of that gives you a transcendent reason to wake up. He looked at Muslims and saw people who still believe that every action is tied to divine order, and that belief shapes how they behave. He'd say, look at the families, the communities, the sense of belonging. You can't find that on social media. And man, that was the start of people going, wait, what's Peterson doing? Why is he talking about Islam like that? But the truth is, he wasn't glorifying it. He was analyzing it like a scientist who's suddenly realizing that maybe the ancient people knew something modern psychology missed. It's like he started to see that faith wasn't just superstition. It was structure, a manual for sanity. And when he spoke about that, you could tell deep down he admired it. Said, now, when you put that next to Nick Fuentes, the energy completely changes. Peterson was slow, thoughtful, wrestling with ideas like a philosopher. Fuentes came in like a damn firecracker, raw, loud, unfiltered. He didn't dress his words in nuance. He just dropped bombs like the West is collapsing because it abandoned God. And Islam hasn't. People lost their minds over that. But underneath all the noise, that's what he was really saying. He looked at Western culture, the moral confusion, the identity crisis, the way everything sacred has been turned into content. And he thought, yeah, this isn't sustainable. Fuentes didn't care about sounding academic. He cared about sounding right, and that's what made him so controversial. He'd call out hypocrisy. He'd point at Western governments preaching freedom while destroying tradition. Then he'd look at Islam and say, hey, at least they still know who they are. You can disagree with his politics, but there was a brutal honesty in the way he said it. He wasn't trying to convert anyone. He was trying to provoke thought, or at least force people to look in the mirror. And the thing is, he wasn't wrong about one part, the strength of conviction. Whether you like Islam or not, you can't deny that believers in it move with a kind of certainty that's vanished elsewhere. Fuentes envied that. He saw young Westerners drowning in irony and anxiety, while Muslim youth were still proud of who they were, still rooted in something timeless. It blew his mind. He'd go on these rants about how secularism promised freedom but delivered depression. You could tell he didn't understand the theology, but he felt the power of that unity. That's what made his statements sound both ignorant and strangely insightful. He wasn't a scholar, he was an alarm bell. Like some angry kid yelling, hey, they've still got something real over there. It's messy, but that's what made people listen. Even when he crossed the line. And man, he did a lot. There was a strange kind of truth buried inside all that chaos. When you look at both of them together, Peterson and Fuentes, it's like two sides of the same storm, man. One's whispering about meaning, the other's shouting about decay, but both pointing in the same direction, both saying, hey, something's happening here that the world isn't ready to face. You could almost feel it in the air. That sense that maybe Islam wasn't just some distant religion, maybe it was holding on to something the rest of the world had dropped and forgotten. Peterson would come at it from that calm, analytical angle. He'd say, when you destroy order, chaos fills the vacuum. And he'd point out how modern Western culture keeps trying to fill that vacuum with material comfort, but the soul still starves. He'd look at Islam and say, look, they still connect everything back to God, their laws, their family life, their daily habits. And you could tell that fascinated him, because for a psychologist, that's structure at a massive civilizational scale. Fuentes, on the other hand, didn't analyze, he accused. He was like, the West mocked faith, mocked masculinity, mocked discipline, and now we're paying the price. His tone was almost bitter, like someone watching his own home burn and realizing the neighbor's house, the one everyone used to laugh at, somehow didn't catch fire. He'd go, say what you want, but they still have boundaries and we don't. That's the kind of stuff that made his audience explode, either cheering or hating him. And honestly, that's what made this whole prediction of theirs so wild. They weren't saying Islam would take over with violence or numbers. They were saying it might take over morally. Because when everything collapses, people run to the only thing that still stands. They both saw it coming, different roads, same conclusion. It's like they were warning the West, if you don't fix your soul, you'll borrow someone else's. It's wild because when you listen to Peterson talk about it, you don't hear a man pushing religion. You hear a man haunted by truth. You hear someone realizing that meaning isn't something you invent. It's something you align yourself with. He'd say things like, you don't get to decide what's sacred. Reality decides that for you. And when he talked about Islam, you could feel him wrestling with that idea, that maybe the West made a mistake by treating faith like an optional accessory instead of the foundation of civilization. He described Islam like this living example of what happens when belief and action are fused together. Not perfect. He never said that, but functional. And that's what got him, because he spent decades studying what keeps people sane, what gives life order. And here was a society that had built that order into its daily rhythm. You wake up, you pray, you fast, you give, you live in alignment with something higher. That's psychological structure at its finest. You can almost imagine him sitting there thinking, damn, this might be the kind of thing modern people are starving for. Now, contrast that with Fuentes. His tone was totally different. His thing was rage. He wasn't trying to understand Islam. He was trying to shock people awake. He'd say stuff like, you all think liberalism is freedom, but look at your families, your cities, your mental health. You're enslaved by your own emptiness. He was extreme, but that's what got him attention. He'd point to Islam and say, look how they protect their values, how they don't bow to every new trend. And that anger, that frustration, was less about Islam itself and more about how the West gave up the fight. And the craziest part, they were both saying versions of the same thing. One was crying it out in a storm of frustration. The other was whispering it through philosophy and myth. But underneath all that noise, there was one line running through both of them without belief. Society rots. They could both smell it. The decay, the drift, the emptiness, and it scared them. Peterson intellectualized it. Fuentes screamed it. And that's why their words hit like they did. Because deep down, people knew they weren't wrong. What really hit people was the tone. Not just what they said, but how they said it. When Peterson spoke about Islam, he sounded like a man trying to decode a secret language written into the universe. You could almost hear the awe in his voice. He wasn't saying, they're right, we're wrong. He was saying, they still believe in something real. He'd talk about how Islam ties every act, eating, speaking, even breathing, back to a divine principle. For him, that wasn't dogma, it was psychology. He saw that as a framework that tells people who they are, where they belong, and why their lives matter. That's deep stuff, man, because we live in a world where nobody knows what the hell they're doing anymore. People don't even know what they believe in. They just chase dopamine hits. Peterson was like, that's not freedom. That's slavery to your impulses. And then he'd look at Islam and say, maybe that's what happens when a civilization builds itself around submission to truth instead of obsession with self. That word, submission, it freaks people out. But to him, it meant humility. It meant accepting that you're not the center of the universe. And he thought maybe that humility is the missing piece in the West's collapse. Fuentes, though, he turned that same observation into a war cry. He didn't talk like a psychologist. He talked like a guy at a protest with a megaphone. They've got conviction. We've got confusion, he'd yell. They stand for family. We stand for nothing. It was harsh, but it landed. Because you can't deny the contrast. He looked at the chaos, gender wars, culture wars, moral relativism, and saw Islam as this giant wall that refused to fall. He'd call it the last fortress of belief. And maybe that's why both of them shocked people. Because whether you loved them or hated them, they were touching a nerve. They were saying out loud what a lot of people were quietly feeling, that modern life feels empty, that something ancient might hold the answer, and that maybe, just maybe, the people we've been told to fear actually hold the blueprint we lost. And here's the thing, man. When you strip away all the noise, all the controversy, what they were both pointing to wasn't Islam as a threat. It was Islam as a mirror. That's what blew people's minds. Because it forced the West to look at itself and ask, what do we even stand for anymore? You could hear it in Peterson's voice every time he talked about morality and order. He'd say, if you remove the sacred, something else will take its place, ideology, chaos, nihilism. And then he'd pause like he was realizing in real time that maybe we already replaced it and it's killing us slowly. He saw in Islam a kind of collective discipline that the modern world just can't replicate. He admired how belief translates into action, not just private but public, how the spiritual and the social are connected. To him, that was integration. He'd look at the West, fragmented, divided, cynical, and you could feel the sadness in him. It wasn't envy, it was grief. Like, we used to have that. We used to believe in something too. Fuentes, he didn't grieve. He raged. He saw the same cracks and just screamed about them. He'd rant about how people mock traditional faith, how everything sacred gets turned into memes. And then he'd point at Islam and say, they don't let that happen. He saw power in that resistance. Maybe he exaggerated, maybe he misunderstood a lot. But his instinct wasn't wrong. He saw that strength comes from conviction, and conviction comes from faith. The irony is they both scared people because they said it out loud. They didn't whisper it like an academic theory. They threw it in everyone's face. Islam might outlast the West. That's a sentence that sends shivers down political spines, but they weren't talking about empires. They were talking about meaning. They meant spiritual survival. They meant that when everything else collapses, money, politics, identity, the only thing left standing will be belief. And they thought Islam had protected that better than anyone else. Deta and man, when you really think about that, about both of them saying those things before everything went down, before Peterson got sick, before all the chaos in Fuentes' world, it almost feels prophetic. Like they both saw something coming that most people are too distracted to notice. The collapse of certainty, the rise of confusion, the way people can't even agree on what's real anymore, and then out of nowhere, these two guys, completely different backgrounds, totally different temperaments, start pointing at the same place, Islam. Jordan Peterson came from the world of intellect and psychology, but he ended up talking about faith like a pilgrim lost in the desert finally seeing water. You could sense he was humbled by it, like he'd been circling around the truth his whole life and was finally catching a glimpse of it. He wasn't preaching. He was reflecting. You could hear it in that trembling, deliberate way he speaks, like he's trying not to exaggerate something sacred. He saw Islam not as an enemy, but as a civilization that had managed to hold on to God while everyone else let him slip through their fingers. Jordan Fuentes, though, he went down swinging. Loud, messy, he controversial, but behind all that chaos, you could feel a young man panicking about what happens when a world loses its soul. He'd say the quiet part out loud, if we keep living like this with no truth, no family, no faith, something stronger will replace us, and that something stronger was what scared and fascinated him about Islam. He said it like a warning, not a wish. Like he knew the pendulum was swinging and no one could stop it. Deta, and what makes their words stick is that they weren't just talking about religion. They were talking about human survival. The need to believe in something, to stand for something, to fight for meaning in a world that laughs at the idea of meaning. Whether you agree or not, you can't deny the weight of that. Because at the end of the day, what they were both trying to say, through all the philosophy, anger, confusion, and honesty, was simple: the modern world forgot how to kneel. And the moment you forget that, everything else starts to fall apart.